Another old chestnut that we see in the task force report, and which has led to some recommendations of the task force, is this idea that there is one set of regulations and that one size fits all, and that there's no differentiation between different parts of the state. And without nitpicking Mr. Honeycutt on the definition of agricultural land and how it's applied, let me point to some of those. There is no statewide minimum lot size, even though there's an 80-acre default minimum lot size for agricultural land in those two thick statutes. In fact, state-approved, locally adopted minimum lot sizes on agricultural land in Oregon range from 20 acres to 320 acres, based upon local characteristics, the kinds of agriculture that are practiced, the characteristics of commercial farming for those crops and those landforms. So, which is the one size that fits all? I have other examples in my testimony about development standards inside urban growth boundaries that vary dramatically from community to community. The task force also points to what it calls perceptions, and you've heard this discussed several times already today, about unproductive lands that have been misdesignated for farming or forestry. And the task force argues for a highly complicated new process to go back over land designations and to undertake new studies and try to come up with new definitions, new mapping processes at considerable expense at both the state and local level. Let me simply remind the committee that according to LCDC's own data, since 1989, counties following existing law have redesignated at least 20,000 acres of agricultural land to other rural categories. It is possible. It is done. It may be expensive on a case-by-case, applicant-driven process, but there's nothing preventing counties from undertaking it as a legislative matter and trying to identify specific areas in which several properties are misdesignated. There is a process in place. We should ask the question very carefully, what's broken? Why does it need this fix? Let me very briefly, because you want to end this hearing at some point, go over some of the points that I think merit the committee's careful consideration for legislation. First, incentivizing regional planning. I'll defer to Representative Greenlick about the success or failure of the idea of annexation law change as one of the incentives, but the premise that we should pay more attention to the regions, particularly the growing regions of our state, and provide mechanisms that ensure that regional problems can be addressed effectively should be taken up by the committee. One of the small tragedies of last session was that Springfield was granted essentially an annulment of a 35-year-old working relationship with Lane County and Eugene because of a breakdown in the existing system of regional coordination. It ought to be addressed. Springfield isn't isolated. Springfield is part of a metropolitan area. And every one of our larger communities in Oregon ought to have more tools for working together, not fewer. Capacity for planning. So many of the problems that the task force has heard about, particularly these concerns about misdesignated lands, have a root in the fact that compared to other western states, according to the task force, Oregon counties spend less on planning. We have underfunded this planning function at the local level, and I think you could persuade Mr. Whitman to say it's been underfunded at the state level as well. This is not a time to start building planning empires with public dollars. But it is a time to ask serious questions about how we expect to accomplish better planning in our communities, clearer rulemaking, clearing out the thickets, unless we are willing to put some resources into that and ensure that that work can be done. So we're wholeheartedly behind the task force's recommendation that additional capacity be provided at the state level and at the county and city level. Public involvement. We're concerned that the task force waited until it had completed its recommendations before taking them to the public, as opposed to engaging the public at the front end. But the task force at least identified for the rest of us the fact that planning needs the people. In fact, planning has always been at its best in Oregon and in Oregon's communities when the public was actively engaged in it, when it wasn't left to public interest groups, special interests, to the bureaucrats, but engaged the community. When planning and zoning becomes a series of referee decisions between applicants and opponents and loses track of the vision of a community and the dialogue with the community about where it should go in the future, it's not going to be relevant for very long. We need to do what Arnold Kogan reported to you the original Land Conservation and Development Commission did in 1974. They had hearings all over Oregon on the statewide planning goals. They engaged 10,000 people face-to-face. They had a mailing list of 100,000 in a state that barely had 2 million people. And as Mr. Kogan suggested, that level of engagement meant that there were conversations all over Oregon about land use planning that carried over into the planning process at the county and city level over the next few years, and which allowed people to make informed decisions when they were asked in 1976 and 1978 to repeal the land use planning laws, and they rejected those proposals. Finally, we very strongly support the strategic planning recommendations of the task force. Oregon faces big issues, bigger issues than the miszoning of a few thousand acres of land in rural areas. It may not be more important to those specific landowners, but we know that the pressures Oregon will face as, by the official projection, we grow by 1.6 million between now and 2040, and by the unofficial estimate of many experts, it'll be more like 2 million, and it'll probably be earlier than 2040 when those 2 million people arrive. We need to be prepared for that kind of development and make sure that the result strengthens our communities and leaves us the state that we love in a recognizable shape. We know that climate change is here and beginning to affect us. We don't know what the consequences will be. We know there will be consequences regardless of our efforts to mitigate our contribution to it. But land use planning will play a very important role both in mitigation and in adapting our communities and our landscapes to the impact of drought and flood and other consequences. And finally, what we've gone through since October of this year, when the financial collapse in the United States led to a worldwide economic decline. We know that the interconnected global economy leaves our state and our communities at great peril. It's a source of potential strength, but we need the resilience to deal with the threats of the global economy. And that kind of resilience can be built into our communities and our state if we have a forward-looking plan. We need a strategic plan. We have no plan yet for getting one. That should be a primary focus of the work you do in this committee in response to the Big Look Task Force. Thanks for the opportunity to testify.
Thanks.